Welcome to the Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights launch of the annual Humanizing Palestine lecture series. My name is Sahar Aziz. I'm a distinguished professor of law at Rutgers Law School and also the executive director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. For decades, Palestinians have been vilified and portrayed as terrorists, as savages, through negative stereotypes. And that has caused hundreds, if not thousands, of Palestinians in the United States to experience discrimination, as well as Arabs and Muslims to also experience discrimination because of these negative racist stereotypes. What enables that type of racism, systemic racism, and anti-Palestinian racism, to be more specific, is the complete dehumanization of a people, of a culture, of a history. And that, in large part, is due to a lack of education and a lack of opportunity for Palestinians to speak on their own behalf, to tell their own stories, to explain to people interested in knowing more about them as a people, as a culture, as a history, as a diverse group of religions. And so we're proud to offer that opportunity today to Palestinian attorney Raja Shehadeh, who will be presenting his book, which I highly recommend if you haven't read it, called Palestinian Walks, Forays, and a Vanishing Landscape. Before I introduce our esteemed guests, I encourage you to visit the Center for Security, Race, and Rights website at csrr.rutgers.edu and take advantage of the numerous resources that we have, and also to watch our past videos and lectures that focus on Muslim, Arab, and South Asian civil rights and human rights, both in the United States and abroad. And all of those lectures are available on our YouTube channel. And finally, if you are a podcast fan, we recently launched the Race and Rights podcast, where we also interview and discuss hot topics that affect the human and civil rights of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities on that podcast. So I encourage you to subscribe and to rate us highly. And related to our talk today, I will just highlight our latest report that is available on our website called Presumptively Anti-Semitic Islamophobic Tropes in the Palestine-Israel Discourse. This report was published by the Center, authored by Mitchell Plitnick and myself, for the purpose of debunking the Islamophobic stereotype that Arabs, Muslims, Palestinians are presumptively anti-Semitic, simply because they are defending the human rights of Palestinians, simply because they are criticizing a nation state's policies and practices, in this case, the state of Israel. And to accuse them of anti-Semitism simply for those activities that in the US are protected by the US Constitution is itself a racist trope. So it is my distinct honor today to introduce to you our featured guest, Raja Shehadeh, who is a Palestinian lawyer, writer, and the founder of the human rights organization Al-Haq. Mr. Shehadeh is the author of several books on human rights and international law, including Occupier's Law and From Occupation to Interim Accords. He was a legal advisor for the negotiations in Washington, D.C. following the Madrid Peace Conference in 1991. He is also the author of several acclaimed books, including the Orwell Prize-winning book, which we will be talking about today, Palestinian Walks, and as well as other books such as Occupation Diaries, Where the Line is Drawn, Going Home, A Walk Through 50 Years of Occupation, and We Could Have Been Friends, My Father and I, which was a finalist for the National Book Award. His most recent book is What Does Israel Fear from Palestine? Mr. Shehadeh has also written for The Guardian, The New Yorker, Granta, and other publications. He lives in Ramallah, Palestine. Raja, thank you so much for joining us today. And the virtual floor is now yours. يا أهلا وسهلا.
Thank you. Thank you, Sahar, for this wonderful introduction and for Rutgers Law School for inviting me to this series of Humanizing Palestine to speak about my book, Palestinian Walks. Palestinian Walks was published in 2007. Please mark this date. It blends the personal with the political. It consists of 7 walks taken over a period of 27 years. Each walk begins at a point in time and ends at the time the book was completed, describing the changes to the landscape that occurred over that period of time. The walks start in 1979. At that time, the hills were still one nature reserve. Palestine is a land of biblical beauty, of olive groves, grapevine, stone buildings, rolling hills, wadis, and cliffs. In Palestinian Walks, I invite the reader to come along for the unique experience of a sarha in Palestine. The 7 walks that comprise the book evoke the land, its history, and one Palestinian's political struggles, disappointments, and hope. The book describes a vanishing landscape. It shows how my life and the fate of the landscape are utterly intertwined. It's an immensely personal account of life in one of the world's most troubled regions and a poignant story of how a pleasure that so many take for granted, the freedom to roam through the countryside, is being destroyed by the massive project of building settlements where only Israeli Jews are allowed to live, along with a network of wide roads to connect them to Israel, roads that do not follow the contours of the hills, but strike right through them. In the first walk, I describe the case of Francois Albina, whose land was taken to build Beit Horon settlement, now a flourishing settlement that forms part of the wider ring encircling Jerusalem. Using various forced claims that represent all the varieties of legal devices Israel has used to claim Palestinian land, starting from the claim that the land belongs to an absentee, to the claim of public land, and finally that it was expropriated by Jordan. After months of legal arguments before the committee, this is how the case ended. The Military Objections Committee found that, quote, "There is no doubt in our eyes that the appellant, Albina, is the legal owner of the land in question," unquote. Even so, the committee decided that the transaction which the custodian has made with the Zionist agency to lease the land for a period of 49 years, quote, is in fact standard, strong and binding, and this in spite of the fact that we concluded, in our opinion, that the ownership of the said land belongs to the appellant. So, as you can see, a Palestinian could never win. In light of this, Jonathan Kuttab, my colleague at Al-Haq, and I discussed in one of the walks taken in 1981 what is being planned. I wrote in Palestinian Walks, "In my walk, I soon got to that part of the Wadi which always inspired talk when I walked with Jonathan. Far away from town, next to the dry stream between the hills, we would sit on the rock, our feet dangling in the grass. Jonathan was thinking of getting married. We discussed his prospects. We talked of what lay ahead for us. We had both read the settlement master plan drawn up by the Jewish Regional Council in the West Bank in cooperation with the Settlement Department of the World Zionist Organization. According to this plan, 80,000 Israeli Jews were to be settled in our hills by 1986 in 25 settlements and 20 outposts. To make this possible, $2 billion were to be allocated. Tons of concrete were to be poured over these hills. The plan called for paving roads at a rate of 150 kilometers a year. Every year, over 500 dunums, a dunum is 1,000 square meters, of industrial zones would be developed. All the available material resources would be monopolized by these settlers. Settlement blocks would spread over the entire area, and our towns and villages would be isolated, their growth hindered by a massive road network. The plan viewed our presence here as a constraint and aimed at preventing our undesirable development. By creating new human settlements where none existed, connecting them with the roads and isolating existing ones, it would not only strangle our communities, but also destroy this beautiful land, and in a matter of a few years, change what had been preserved for centuries. Ariel Sharon, the then defense minister, declared, "We are going to leave an entirely different map of the country that it will be impossible to ignore." Menachem Begin, the prime minister at the time, announced, "Settlement is the soul of Zionism." The Israeli newspapers reported that the government in Israel had asserted that it would never accept dividing the greater land of Israel, never agree to the establishment of a Palestinian state between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea. We were certain that we could not remain idle in the face of this existential threat. We had to do everything we could to resist. If the plan should be implemented, generations of young Jewish kids would grow up in our hills, considering them their home, and we would have another 100 years of struggle over this part of Palestine. As we sat on the rock in the Wadi al-Aqdi, Jonathan and I proceeded to formulate our legal struggle against the Israeli plan. I will now go back to the first walk, where I write that, as a child, I always heard about Harrashi, the stone ruin in the hills where my grandfather Abu Amin would spend half the year tending his olive trees and grapevines. He would go on a sarha and not come back for 6 months. In Palestinian village culture, going on a sarha means roaming freely, aimlessly, not restricted by time and place, going where the spirit takes you, a sort of drug-free high, Palestinian style. All this has now become impossible with the settlements, many of which are inhabited by extremist right-wing Jews who attack Palestinians living nearby or taking hikes in these hills. When I began hill walking in the late 70s, I wanted to experience the sarha. Then one day in spring of 1978, I took a walk that brought me to Harrashi, which I describe in the first walk. Much has happened since that first spring walk. I went into many struggles through human rights activism and legal cases to save the land from expropriation and from being declared public land that is exclusively reserved to the Jewish Israeli public. In chapter 4, called Monasteries in the Desert, after a walk that ends at the monastery of St. George of Koziba, I describe how that remote, attractive land has been ruined by settlements. The following is from pages 149 to 150. During earlier walks, all that I could see was the empty wilderness. Now the area looked like a construction site, as the new roads to the settlements of Ma'aleh and Akhmas, Kfar Adumim, and Mitzpeh Yericho were dug in the hills, and land was leveled in preparation for building yet more houses there. Once these settlements are complete, a wedge will divide the West Bank into northern and the southern enclave and put an end to the dream of a Palestinian state. I then wrote on page 150, in the silence and rhythm of my footsteps, I began to reflect on the course of my life over recent years. As long as I was engaged in the struggle, I believed that international law, rationality, and decency would ultimately prevail. The Jewish prophet Isaiah, who famously cried in vain in the wilderness, was supposed to have stopped here in this wadi on his way to Egypt. I too have been crying out in the wilderness to a world that did not hear. Along with many other committed Palestinians from the occupied territories, I addressed the Israeli public and warned that the future would be bleak for all of us if these settlements were not stopped. I also went on speaking tours in the US, alone and with others, Palestinians and Israelis alike, to caution against a disastrous policy that supported and funded the settlement project. Isaiah so despaired that he begged for an end to his life without hope. I hoped I would never know such despair. This leads me to the following reflection. On page 150, I wrote, the wilderness behind the Jerusalem is now mainly settled, and the monks live in an area that has been declared a nature reserve. The changing times offer them yet another challenge among the many tribulations they have had to overcome during their long residence in this lonely valley. This time, the transformation is permanent. Whatever the resolution of this intractable political conflict, this area will never return to being the wilderness it once was. Ishaya would not want his life back. As to the resilient monks, I have no doubt that they will survive as they have in the past. We rested at the monastery garden, ate a few oranges, drank water, and continued our walk to Jericho, the oldest continually inhabited city in the world. In the past, it had survived on agriculture and the services it rendered to visitors from the hills who came to enjoy its mild weather and good restaurants. Now, with the checkpoints blocking all entrances to the city, desperate, unemployed young men living inside have found work helping to build the nearby settlements and working as day laborers in the Israeli industrial zones. Not only was Israel rezoning our land, it was determining our society's economic and social life. At the end of the walk, as we were taking a shared taxi back to Ramallah, I looked out at the blazing mist over the western hills of Jerusalem, high above the Gor, and thought to myself, what are you complaining about? Materially, I had lost nothing. I still had my law office and my home. I had a happy marriage. I knew I would be able to find ways of dealing with the trauma of defeat. Somehow, despite the problems and fears, I would continue to walk and to write. At my age, my father had successfully survived 2 catastrophic defeats. I was more fortunate. So far, I've had to deal with only one. After years of nonviolent intifada, the International Peace Conference was held in Madrid to start the negotiations for an end to the long-lasting conflict in Palestine-Israel. This eventually led to the Oslo Accords. In effect, the tremendous hope that these negotiations generated led to a closed door, which I describe in the third walk entitled Illusory Portals, and which mainly takes place in the Dead Sea area. In Jerusalem wilderness, I stood on an escarpment looking at the crystal clear blue sea below. The sea was in danger of disappearing, declining by about a meter every year. It was literally slipping from under our feet, as the hopes for a just peace had slipped away. The sea spread before me, so perfectly blue and sparkling. Usually, seawater contains 4 to 6% solids. The imprisoned waters of the Dead Sea contain 24% solids. It is not water to dive into. If it enters the lungs, it can lead to death. In the course of the traveling to get to the start of the walk, I describe how as we drove further down to the Jericho, we passed the fledgling new settlement of Mitzpeh, Jericho. The language of conquest was writ large over the hills, over the wilderness, in every corner of the land. Everything signaled our defeat, from the earlier rows of settlement apartment blocks piled over the dry pink hills forming the city of Ma'ali Adumim to this latest settlement venture in the wilderness. When I got to Wadi Daraji in the third walk, I had to pass along a narrow passage that rounded a rock protruding from the cliff with a deep gorge by the side. As I was considering taking the risk, I stood there, and at that moment, passing through my mind was how my work for justice and saving the land had come to nothing. Because of this disappointment in how things had turned out, I felt that I had lost the confidence that I wouldn't let myself fall to my death. I felt that my grip on life had loosened, and I was suicidal. I stood above the cliff, looking down into the gorge, and began to fret again. I kept stretching my neck around the turn. Every time I saw that rock protruding, I imagined that once I was in the middle, it would somehow push me down. Or was it that I feared that I would jump? Did I trust myself not to throw myself into the valley of death with its sharp rock where I would have no chance of surviving. The penultimate walk is called an emergent sarha. In it, as I cross the stream of Wadi Delb, I see a settler from the settlement of Dolev smoking dope. I drop my hat. The settler calls me. I'm surprised to be accosted by a settler, but I stop and try to pick up my hat, now bobbing over the water. But he's more nimble and gets to it first. Then he realizes that he has left his rifle leaning on the rock and is worried I will rush and grab it. And so we are held together for a tense moment of silence and stillness. Should he trust me? Should he help me retrieve my hat? That moment represents the relationship between the two sides. On the one hand, a young Israeli man of 25 who grew up in the illegal settlement established on land which the Israeli military had confiscated from Palestinians. He had come to love the land as his own and consider it home. But he never comes without his gun. He is protected by his gun. And today he brought his hubble bubble, his nargile, for a smoke by the stream next to where he lives. And I, who had grown up in the land whose ancestors had terraced and cultivated, who is now denied even the pleasure of walking in peace in it, as I had done throughout my adult life. I'm taking a risk simply by coming to walk in the hills next to where I live. I always conscious of the danger of being shot at by armed settlers. So we talked. He gives me his version of history and current reality. I listen and try to give him mine. We are too far apart, but at least we talk and recognize that the future is dismal unless a just solution can be reached. Such an encounter now is unthinkable. This is where matters stood in 2007 at the time that I wrote the book. Where are we now? According to the International Crisis Group, since 7 October, there have been over 1,000 incidents of settler violence in which over 1,300 Palestinians have been driven from their homes. There were over 5,350 violent incidents in the West Bank involving settlers since data collection began in 2016. The Israeli army and settlers have displaced 1,285 Palestinians and destroyed 641 structures, according to OCHA, the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and at least 15 Palestinian farming communities have been completely cleared and counting. On September 6th, Haaretz editorialized that Israel has decided to turn the West Bank into the Gaza Strip. The army started using new methods of combat, some of which until then had been implemented only in Gaza and Lebanon. Drones and Air Force planes have become the main instruments of destruction against wanted suspects, as well as innocent people in numbers unseen since the Second Intifada. This is what Haaretz wrote on 6th September. The Israeli government has also removed the cloak of Israel's long-standing efforts at de facto annexation. The government's public coalition agreement specified the exclusive right of self-determination for Jews in the land of Israel, including Judea and Samaria. A special ministerial position was created to transfer governing authorities from a putatively temporary military body to a civilian arm of the state, a bureaucratic de jure mark of permanent possession. One bright, hopeful development is the advisory opinion of the ICJ, International Court of Justice at The Hague. The ICJ declared its ruling on 19 July 2024. It concluded that Israel should put an end to its illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories, desist from creating new settlements, and evacuate those already established. Whether or not the world would heed this decision remains to be seen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raja. That was very moving and just the tip of the iceberg of your beautiful prose in your book, Palestinian Walks, which I would highly recommend to those who have not read it yet. If attendees would like to ask a question, you can use the Q&A function. In the meantime, I'm going to take my moderator's prerogative and ask a few questions, Raja. So you've ended the talk with the encounter between you and the settler from Dolev. Can you say why such an encounter is now impossible?
It's become impossible because even going near a settlement or anywhere in the periphery means that you can be shot at and attacked by the settlers. And this has happened numerous times. And we cannot any longer even walk in our hills. So that's why.
And you mentioned that he had a gun. And can you explain, I mean, you're a lawyer, a Palestinian lawyer, international lawyer. So the settlers are legally permitted to carry guns, and are the Palestinians also legally permitted to carry guns?
No, the settlers have been carrying guns since a very long time now, and they have been allowed more and more guns and more. They can shoot with impunity now, and the Palestinians, of course, are not allowed to carry guns.
Yeah, we're starting to see more in Western media, which is already tends to be much more sympathetic to the Israeli perspective. But even through that filter, we are starting to see an increase in violence, Israeli settler violence against Palestinians. And at least according to the news, especially if you read the English news coming out of Israel, there appears not to be much enforcement of criminal law, because presumably the settlers are subject to Israeli criminal law, which I would hope prohibits the killing and murder of other individuals, whoever the targets may be.
I want to say that this had started in 1982. And in 1982, Al-Haq started investigating these attacks by the settlers and tried to get Israel to investigate them. And tried. And finally, there was a CARP report in 1984, and it wasn't implemented for many years. And now it's become much more. Now there are pogroms. Outright pogroms against Palestinians. They come to the village nearby and they burn houses and shoot at people and steal the sheep of the shepherds. And it's just terrible. It's like the Wild West.
It's lawless. And I just want to note from our vantage point in the United States, when we report or when we talk about pogroms by Israeli settlers against Palestinians, even when the facts support that conclusion, we are accused of being anti-Semitic, as if only Jews can be the victims of pogroms, but they can never be the perpetrators of pogroms against other people, in this case, Palestinians. So even talking about it is difficult in the United States, unfortunately.
Well, it's ludicrous because it's happening and it's definitely pogroms.
So how are the relations between the two communities right now, between the Palestinians and the Israeli settlers that are in the West Bank?
There are no relations. They live on one side, we live on the other side, and they take the land and take the resources, natural resources, and take every spring and every beautiful place and treat it as their own and don't allow Palestinians to get anywhere near. And so it's a very colonial, the worst of colonial relationships.
And in the book, you mentioned the names of the various features of the land where you walked, the hills and the wadis. Can you tell us how you learned about these names?
You know, it's very interesting because the colonial project tries to change the names of features of the land, and they have been doing that. They have then done that in Palestine in 48, of course, and now they're doing it in the West Bank. And some people now use these names to refer to features or roads or crossroads and so on. And when I walked in these hills, I realized I didn't even know the names of the hills and the wadis and the escarpments and the springs. And I thought that it's very important for me to preserve these by finding out what these names are. So I asked the geographer Kamal Abdel Fattah, who was now died, and he employed his students to go to the hills and asked all people, only old people, because only old people knew the names of all these places. And he gave me a map with all the names on it, and I used it and was very careful to use the right names in every place. And that's a way of preserving the heritage and the land and so on. And of course, now many of these places have been destroyed and they're no longer there. So I preserved in words what is a vanishing landscape. That was the purpose of the book.
Right, and I think it's so important that that type of information is recorded, and that history is recorded, and that knowledge is produced, so that we can debunk the myth that is quite racist, that Palestinians never existed. There was never a Palestine, which of course is a propaganda talking point by the Israeli state, which has every interest in causing the world to believe that, so that they can claim that there was a land without a people, when in fact there were a people there. So relatedly, what is the role of literature in humanizing Palestine? And related to that, how did you go about writing this book?
I think literature is very important in humanizing Palestine, because a good book, and a book that makes the reader identify with the characters in the book and with the events in the book, has a very strong impact, much stronger than any other kind of writing. And in the West, of course, in Israel also, they have many books and many of the Jewish story books, which are taught in schools and make people identify with the Jewish characters, which is very important, of course. But there aren't enough books on Palestinian side which do the same. There are many books about Palestine. There are many books, academic books, but there aren't many books and good books, good literature that brings to the reader the person, the Palestinian as a human being, and with whom one can identify and carry in his head the person that he reads about. And so it's very important. Literature is very important, humanizing, I think, the Palestinian. How I went about writing the book? Well, it's, I've always enjoyed walking, and I always enjoyed writing, and I never thought I could combine the two joys together. And then I was talking to my publisher, and the suggestion came that I write a book about walking. And I thought, what a wonderful idea. And I didn't think that such a book could be possible. And so I started thinking about it, and then realized that I have a good memory of all the walks that I've taken over the years, since 1979, of course, and all the trails that I followed, and all the pleasure that I had, and all the talks that I had with friends over these walks. And I combined the walks with the history, and it became a narration of the history and also of the legal aspects, and made it into a personal book about politics and land and law. And I was very gratified when I heard from many people who said that only after they read the book could they understand so many things about the legal aspects which had escaped them. And I had written so much about the legal aspects, so many books, so many articles, and I never got through to people in the same way that I did in this book. And so it's been very gratifying to write this book. And I feel that now that many of these walks are no longer possible, and no longer the trails are obliterated, I feel that I had at least preserved in words some of the beauty of the land and some of the pleasures of these walks, and for future generations to read about, and to know that something like that existed.
I want to thank you so much, Raja, for joining us today to discuss and give us an introduction to your book, Palestinian Walks, A Foray into a Vanishing Landscape. It is intellectuals and lawyers like you who share your experiences, your legal expertise, and your empathy that allows us to show the various audiences, especially in the Western countries, the humanization, or to humanize Palestinians. A group of people, a culture, a heritage, with a very deep and rich identity that has existed on the land of Palestine for centuries. And so it is truly our honor to have you here today to help us in humanizing Palestine. Our next lecture in this series is going to be with Nathan Thrall on November 19th. So I encourage everyone to register for that if you haven't already. And again, I will just encourage you to take advantage of the resources that the Center for Security, Race, and Rights has produced. Everything is transparently available online, csrr.rutgers.edu. All of our lectures are recorded on our YouTube channel, so it's a great playlist that you can use when you're driving, or if you'd like to watch, or if you are an academic, to use as a resource to assign to your students. And similarly, if you're a podcast listener, please do subscribe and rate highly the Race and Rights podcast. And so with that, I want to thank you all for joining us today. I want to thank you for having the open mind and the open heart to listen and to learn from the people who have been so unfairly vilified in American media and in Western media, and to appreciate the beauty of and the kindness and the richness of the Palestinian culture and the Palestinian people. And so with that, thank you very much. Ma salam.